Thank you. Okay, so we're building on Reframing Deforestation and the book Science, Society and Power, which was doing an ethnography of policy in some form or another. My kind of anthropology I was finding useful. I think other people were finding it useful too. Certainly Ghanaian policymakers were fascinated. Some were a bit skeptical and conducted their own follow-up studies to question, to understand whether or not our work was valid for their particular zones of operation. And in general, this was quite invigorating for us, because we felt that out of ethnographic work, not only were we producing research that was questioning these dominant paradigms in some form or another, but we were instilling in our collaborators that same reflexive desire to know from locality what problems there might be that they hadn't been aware of. And sure enough, you know, the European Union international kind of funding program that was reforesting Guinea suddenly realized that they were dealing with a very different set of problems to the one that they had been thinking. We were collaborating too within Kisidu with some German funding programs and projects, international aid projects that were addressing deforestation that actually hadn't happened. So that helped sort of reformulate. There were some fairly difficult discussions at times, because this isn't just knowledge, this is around institutional practices as well, and the financing of international aid, and were we calling people into account, and those kinds of issues. But this is the kind of thing that anthropology should be doing, you know, in a way, involving themselves, I think, in the wider arenas within which we operate. Well, what I've neglected to say is that during this era, of course, it was also an era shaped in Rwanda and Congo by the Rwandan genocide, and in Congo by the subsequent wars that were both linked to the genocide in Rwanda and then linked to assorted interventions and invasions within DR Congo, and then within even Guinea, in the southeast of Guinea, there were conflicts shaped and shaping relations with Liberia as Liberia became freed of the tyrannical regime of Charles Taylor. So wherever I had worked had become a theatre of war, and I think it was irresponsible of me, or would have been, to not engage in some form or another with those issues. So there was, at another level also, while I was a student for PhD in DR Congo, or in Zaire as was, I also taught at the University of Rwanda and taught anthropology there just prior to the genocide. And of course the issues there were issues around questions of ethnicity on which, you know, the genocide turned. And so teaching ethnicity in a university that then became implicated in the Rwandan genocide was a sort of a challenge that I had cause to reflect on, and the power of anthropology and the transformative power and the dangerous power of anthropology in its representational practices. For those of you who don't know, in a way, many early anthropologists from the 1950s onwards into the 1960s had been writing about Rwanda in ways that would help forge sort of ethnic identities in a way that had transformed them from earlier understanding or earlier practices around what categories such as Tutsi and Hutu meant. It wasn't just anthropology, it was also administration through certain categories and vocabularies, the lexicon of ethnicity. So in many ways, there was a lot of explaining to be done to the international response, and a lot of work to be done to try to help the humanitarian world address the conflict. So these aren't necessarily issues that one wrote about in books, but there was a circulation of people assisting the humanitarian organizations that were addressing the refugee movements out of Rwanda and then into Congo. So some of the debates that emerged, though, around that were the relationship between environment and conflict and questions of grievance and greed. And these began to worry me. And so I did begin to probe some of those debates and the questions, some of the framing of those debates. So, the area of Kivu, where I had done my PhD fieldwork, became a theatre of conflict. And it was a theatre of conflict that was, in a way that was animated by the existence of artisanal mines for the mineral tantalum, which is used in mobile phones, and indeed other rare earths. And the subsequent conflicts in the region have been strongly associated and fueled and financed by that. But then, there are many places around the world which have rare earths which don't have conflicts. So what was it about the sort of political history of Congo that was so destabilizing that these kinds of forms of mining wouldn't were leading to these kinds of conflicts? And so these kind of concepts like greed and grievance were very much looking at the sort of contemporary, I suppose, politics of sort of warlordism and greed and of political dynamics, perhaps, of grievance, that people had grievances against each other. But they didn't really look into the much longer of the history of extractivism that had shaped the social formations in eastern Congo. So what I began to do was to try to show the complexity of political life that was associated with this long exaction, this history of exaction. Because Congo had been colonized by the Belgians at a time associated with rubber extraction. And then the lands of eastern Kivu had been taken for coffee plantation. The nation of DR Congo had been transformed in the build-up to and during the Second World War through the mining of uranium that was used in the atomic bombs in the Second World War. And subsequently, Congo had become a state that was shaped for the desire for cobalt, that was a strategic mineral important for space technology and other contemporary technology. And the battles in Congo around Cuba and America and Russia in the 1960s were heavily shaped by the desire for control over these resources. Congo wasn't just a corner of an African continent; it was a centre for the for global mining and minerals, and has since become even more so with the emergence of the need for tantalum, niobium, and other rare earths. So if one can see how that century and a half now of extractive impulse had shaped politics and sedimented itself within social formations, perhaps one will better understand how intractable conflicts have emerged around any particular point. So, again, out of my fieldwork in the one village in eastern Congo, I could see how just the very arrival of a road had made was a point of contention. There were some people in the village who would profit by having a road. They were traders and who could use the road happily. But others were more sceptical of building a road to the village, first of which it would mean that they might be turfed off their land because there were difficult land rights, but also roads would bring checkpoints, and checkpoints brought forms of control, and not everyone could get through a checkpoint. In order to get through a checkpoint, you needed to have some kind of protection. So if you were a member of, if you were sort of relatively wealthy, you could get protection through your wealth. That's one thing. But if you were a member of the Roman Catholic Church, you could get protection through the parish. If you were a member of a Protestant church, you could get protection through the organisation of the Protestant church. If you were from the local, an employee of the local plantation, you could get protection from the former coffee plantations. If you were part of customary authority, you could get protection from forms of networked customary authority. But everyone had their particular protection, and each of these protection had their particular legal framings, and almost courts, as it were, and or more feudal kind of structures in some form or another. So the area that this road was being built to, the village where I'd done my field work, revealed this fragmentation, this social fragmentation around the kinds of protection you needed in order to get through a checkpoint. Am I making some sense? I hope so. So this wasn't a kind of a village that had a kind of a common kind of cause. It was a very fragmented one, and it was fragmented because you needed protection, because there was a sense within which, ever since the colonial time, you had to pay sort of rents and taxes, and you had to pay but with labour, and people who were protected paid less, and people who weren't were extracted more. And so, in a way, a social formation was emerging that had fragmented across these institutions, almost around forms of finding protection. And I think that had been kind of established during an extremely corrupt Belgian colonial period, where people had gotten around legislation and to get hold of land, and those have been passed on to the post-colonial moments. But the extractivism, a kind of politics of extractivism, had become established within the country, and so yes, there were kind of class-based grievances, but they were more than class-based. They were sort of socially fragmenting with every new need for forms of protection. So gradually the numbers of Protestant churches began to expand. Small new churches would begin to exist, and people would find their future and their security within them. So this was an area of I'm going to call it social fragmentation that you could see even within one village, but what is true for one village became important for particular regions and others. And so the history of the locality was very much visible in the everyday life and politics, which was one of division. And so within that, it was then possible to see how any particular resource becoming valued and not was playing into these sort of forms of division and to emergent conflict. So if you have that version of where division is coming from, it's rather different to those who would see sort of poverty leading to conflict, or environmental degradation leading to conflict. Whereas in the policy literature, those kinds of narratives were beginning to emerge. That people are so poor that they're degrading their environments, leading to further poverty, it's leading to conflict. Or environmental degradation linked to climate change is leading to conflict. These very sort of off-the-shelf narratives of the sort we'd become very sensitive to out of Kisidugu suddenly became, for us, indicators of a global sort of policy establishment that was out of touch with the everyday life that was shaping relations to resources and relations to each other, and the production of armament. The use of arms. And in many ways, I made in a couple of articles a case that it was these conflicts weren't linked to poverty; they were linked to wealth in some form, or at least the establishment of certain extractive processes that were associated with wealth in minerals, with wealth in soil and fertility, with wealth in the various different extractive possibilities that some people were able to profit from and others not. So that I did seek to sort of publish and to bring an anthropology rooted in these more everyday understandings of law and politics, to call into question the grand narratives that were emerging around the causes of conflict in Africa, as it were, which were being conducted almost outside of political registers, outside of the historical registers, and outside of the ways within which histories become visible in social formations. There's a wonderful book by Rosalind Shaw called Memories of the Slave Trade, which explores how the social worlds of initiation societies in Sierra Leone carry a legacy of slavery, even if the people who are leading and conducting and part of those social worlds don't reflect on it in that way. Why? Because in the era of slavery, people came together in certain ways to protect themselves, and those modes of protection flourished, and you can show the historical emergence of them around certain times, and they live on in the everyday practices of communities, even if those communities don't reflect on their origins as linked to slavery. So there's a really interesting book. I can recommend it because it shows the power of a kind of historical anthropology to help us really understand some of the areas that are shaping social worlds that are outside of our cognition, and in a way, and yet which are thoroughly important to understanding sort of the more deep-rooted social worlds that are part of our that are manifesting in the tensions that can undergo can become deadly. Yeah. So maybe I'll stop on that one.